Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 78. Here with Brad. I'm Dan. I feel like I should introduce us occasionally. I don't know. Maybe people can read.
The lineup has not changed, everyone. There was a moment there where it looked like I was going to get replaced, but I'm still here. I'm still kicking.
Yeah, we're considering some kind of stuffed animal taking Brad's spot. We thought the commentary might be a little more lively.
I've got a lot of stuffed animals in this room. I can go grab one if you want. We can make that happen. I can go take a nap.
The Olympics are big in the news right now, and for obvious reasons. Whenever the Olympics happen, it's a big deal, right? The Olympics come along, everybody gets excited. Everyone has always wanted to know who the best at something is. Now, oddly, as time has gone on, we've subdivided athletic skill into smaller and smaller niches. And so, to some degree, it's not that relevant. All of them are incredible athletes. Well, not all of them, because some of the niches are really weird. But all of them are incredible at what they do, whether or not that reflects athletic talent. Anyway, the political aspect of this is that this is all happening in China. And that because there is a national focus on because they represent nations, the athletes are inevitably caught up in politics.
The Olympics are surprisingly political.
They are. Of course, there's always the side things, right? Like who's sitting by who, or who talks to who, or did so-and-so come, or this country that's out of favor. Are they, what are their athletes here, and those kind of things. But beyond that, among the power players, which for whatever reason people have, it was clear why before. It used to be Russia and the U.S., and now it's kind of the U.S. and China. These are the rivalries, I guess, is the right way to think of it. Every good sports story needs a rivalry. Used to be us and Russia in the Cold War. It still is a little bit, but mostly now it's us and China. It's the U.S. and whoever thinks they're going to be the next big thing. Whoever wants to show they're better than the U.S. And the rivalry between the U.S. and Russia has a lot of parallels to what's happening right now. Of course, it's also combined with the fact that there's COVID restrictions and the athletes are in a kind of closed loop lockdown in China. I've heard stories, and these are unconfirmed, but reporters of repute have stated them. I just haven't found them in print, haven't looked long enough to see them in print, that some athletes are getting the same meal every day, because there's just been fumbling of menu stuff. A significant portion of athletes are not able to practice their sport.
Yeah, they're not giving adequate practice area.
Yes, in part because of the closed loop and the area they're in. That's a huge deal. That one, I mean, eating the same meal isn't great. Having your nutrition and you're an athlete at the highest level is not ideal. But not being able to do what you do for several days, you want to go
especially
into this
considering how long the Olympics run for. They could be there for a long period of time before they compete in their sport.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if you're there,
events are late.
if you're there for 2 weeks and not able to do anything associated with your sport, and all you can do is pump weights, that puts you at a severe disadvantage.
So there are problems with the facilities. There are problems with the nutrition. There's problems with the what they're being shown. And it's interesting to note
What they're being shown. Sorry, what they see, unrelated to the sport. This closed loop is meant to make China look good, right? One of the reason you host the Olympics is because everybody gets to look at you and see your greatness. It's an opportunity for a nation to flex. Stunt, yeah.
Yes. So China is trying to flex, and it's not going well. It's going really, really poorly for those reasons I mentioned. But also, people have described the area around this closed loop that they can look out and see looks like a wasteland, was how Perry Weiss described it.
if the bit that you're presenting that's supposed to be the best doesn't look good, then that's a really bad sign. Back in North Korea still does this. We were discussing this before this episode. In North Korea, if you go to North Korea as a visitor right now, they do not let you wander around freely.
You have very controlled tours.
Yes, they show you exactly what they want you to see in a pristine little area that is basically a movie set. Russia did the same thing way back when, during the communist era, during the Soviet Union. And you get these professors who thought that Russia was the great revolution.
It was a great utopia.
Yeah. Really prosperous. And they went there and they saw exactly what they wanted them to see. But what was funny is that some of them, looking at the show that Russia put on, saw problems that made them doubt. And if they had seen the real thing, because even the show wasn't as good as the stories had been saying. And it's just, we seem to be getting some similar things here. China, for all its power, and we've discussed China at length a little bit. There's a phrase for you. This is why everything I say should be taken as a gospel truth.
I thought you were going to say, this is why you tune in to Rethinking Politics.
This is why.
For this kind of nonsense.
Stumble around with basic English.
That is one of our trademarks.
This is one of our trademarks.
That and pronunciation.
Rethinking Politics.
Hashtag Brett Weinstein.
With 2 E's. Make it clear here. And this isn't even the substance of what's happening in the Olympics right now that people are focused on. It's actually the cheating that's getting attention. Before we get into the cheating, though, I just want to mention that China's national pride, is a country becomes more nationalist, it inevitably becomes more xenophobic. Right? These things kind of pull at each other. If you're going to say we're the greatest nation in the world and we're the best and we're better than everyone else, that has to diminish them in relation to you. And it's really interesting to see how China is treating athletes who are of Chinese descent and could have competed for the US or China, which is a weird legal gray area because China doesn't allow dual citizenship legally, or so I understand. And yet there are a number of dual citizens who chose to
there are
compete
exceptions to almost every rule, so that makes sense.
Especially in China, right? It's true of anywhere. Usually often things are punished by a fine of some kind, and that means the rich can do it and other people can't. This was true of like the two-child policy and other policies in China from the beginning. And they are trashing an athlete who is an American, essentially, who's competing for them, who failed. And they are praising an athlete who's an American who is competing for them, who succeeded. And they're trashing an athlete who's essentially American and who is competing for us, who's succeeding. And there's a weird propagandistic element to it where, and it's not the normal, like in the West, if somebody does something great, you'll get an article about them being like, wow, they're really amazing. And it'll go on about them. In China, there are on, Weibo, or there's the equivalent of Twitter over there that's different. You'll find tutorials on how to make your face look like this half Chinese girl. Do your makeup so that you can look half Chinese instead of full Chinese, so that you can mimic her beauty. And there are billboards with her face all over them. This skier, and it's this weird. It's so coordinated. When you look at Chinese media, it's a trip.
And it's not that unusual, Dan. It's just something that we haven't seen in a long time. I mean, the Cold War's been over for 30 plus years now, really. And so most of us who are under 40 aren't used to that. But that used to, I mean, this is not, if anything, this is the way the world works most of the time, where you have a country that has a tyrannical government. You have a country that has very restricted, internet access, that has an incredibly propagandistic, government-controlled media sources who use things like the Olympics. I mean, if you go back and you look at Russia during the Cold War and how they interacted with the Olympics, it was a lot like this, where they would use the Olympics to help control their people, where they would even control their athletes when they went to other countries. You know, they had rules about what they couldn't do to make sure they didn't defect because of how terrible life was for people in Russia. Like, there were all these things in place that was all hidden behind this facade of everything being just fine. And most people wouldn't look past that facade because they didn't want to jeopardize diplomatic relations. I mean, we've talked about this before, about how the U.S. tends to kowtow to China, at least in words, in order to keep diplomatic relations with China good. I mean, that's why we refuse to acknowledge the fact that there are two Chinas, that you have Taiwan that also has a legitimate claim to being called a China, and yet we won't call them that. We won't officially acknowledge Taiwan while at the same time telling China we will defend Taiwan against them. You know what I mean? It's nonsense, but it's these ridiculous games that we play in the world of geopolitical relations, which are just so weird.
And it ruins what the Olympics are. I mean, the Olympics are not about nations getting together. It's about people getting together. It's not about which country's superior. It ought to be about who the best is. It ruins the element of athletic competition, which, even that I phrase it like that, an element of it is athletic competition. And that's what most of us think should be the point. And it's entirely overshadowed by politics, essentially. Politics can ruin everything. It turns out you can ruin just about anything with politics. I mean, a good rivalry is fun in sports, but at this level, the political posturing and all this other nonsense. And it should be no surprise then to people that people cheat all the time in the Olympics. There are a number of confirmed scandals, events and things during the Cold War. Russia was cheating like crazy. There are enough whistleblowers now to make that an established fact. The Russian government was involved. Their intelligence agencies helped execute it. They were helping dope up their athletes to make them perform better, which is just. I mean, even thinking about it makes me like the world's a ridiculous place. That this is how we feel, what we feel like we need to do. Recently, the figure skater, the pride of Russia, she's 15. I don't have her name in front of me. There was a big scandal because she apparently failed one of the preliminary drug tests from over a month ago. And they just found out about it. And that story alone is enough to show you how seriously people take these competitions and how unseriously they take stopping people from cheating. The details of it are crazy. So I'm going to read from an article. This is just a Yahoo Sports article.
That's where I get all my news, is Yahoo Sports.
About the Russian anti-doping. I don't know. How many sports publications could you name? Russian Anti-Doping Association's argument.
ESPN.
Since the lab. ESPN. You got one. I know Bleacher Report.
Sorry.
Russian Anti-Doping. You're good.
You might want to start over. I really messed you up there.
So she's already competed in the group figure skating, and Russia won. They won gold. She's going to now compete in the singles, and she's going to win gold. She's crazy good. She should win gold. Probably, right? There's an asterisk by this.
Because, yeah, you never know.
Because she's on stuff. So the Russian Anti-Doping Association argued that since the lab in Sweden didn't process the test for 6.5 weeks, Valieva, there's no way I'm pronouncing that right. I pronounced it like it's a Spanish word.
No, it sounds good. Valieva.
Valieva doesn't have enough time to defend herself. But the WADA, which is the global one, anti-doping agency, the World Anti-Doping Agency, said the delay was because Russia didn't label it a priority sample. So this is the cause, according to the WDA. Russia took one of their Olympic athletes, collected a sample, sent it to the proper lab in Sweden, didn't write priority on it, and that was all it took
for it to take 6.5 weeks to get processed.
Yes, and to have her compete in an Olympic event while on a performance-enhancing drug.
And less about her being on the performance-enhancing drug. She competed. She was, basically almost the entire duration of the Olympics with no information about whether or not she had passed her drug test. You know what I mean? So
right. They just didn't know. Yeah.
So, for example, at my work, we do pre-hired drug screens, and they send them out to a lab. This is not a high-end lab. This is the cheapest place they can find. Right? One of the many labs that you have in every city in the United States. Send them out to this lab, and they do the drug test, and there's just no priority drug test. It's just a regular drug screen. It's not, hey, we need next day turnaround. It's just their regular, their single option, you know what I mean, for drug tests. And the lab sends the results back in 2 or 3 days. So that 95% of the time, unless they start really, really fast, by their first day of employment, they know this person has a clean drug screen, which is how it's supposed to be done, right? So the question you have to ask is, what kind of setup do you have where even the non-priority samples, because all these samples that are coming from the Olympics, you have to assume are from Olympic athletes, unless they're testing the caterers, then all of these samples should be priority. So why they're leaving it up to Russia to mark them doesn't make any sense. But even still, you've got 6.5 weeks.
Is this just a random place that
are
Russia
getting all sorts of samples? It raises a lot of questions, doesn't it?
Right.
But for sure, bizarre. It's not. This is not a system that's set up to actually stop drug use. It'd be the equivalent if my employer said, "Hey, you're responsible to get a drug test. Sign here on this paper saying you're going to do that, and then we'll follow up with you in a couple months and see if you did." You know what I mean? You can choose your own drug testing place. We don't really care. We ask that you do it quickly, though, but we're not going to follow up to see if you did.
That's how a lot of paperwork is handled. And it's handled that way because nobody cares
enough to do it a different way.
Right. Because it doesn't matter.
Because it takes a lot more work to say, hey, we're going to have a lab set up here that's controlled by the WADA. Instead of controlled by you or by Sweden or anyone else, we're going to have our own lab because they could do that. I mean, the number of tests that are going to be going through for the Olympics, we're talking thousands and thousands of tests. So having a small lab set up is probably actually cost effective. And then you can actually control and make sure, okay, we've confirmed, we've got actual independent inspectors who work for the WADA to make sure it's all being done above board. You could do that. Choosing not to is just that. It's a choice. Yeah.
And it's an astounding choice when the alternative is we're counting on your proper labeling. Like this is how did they not know that they hadn't heard back on it? Right? There's so many places here where this is really, really weird. And ultimately, the answer doesn't really matter because what's weird to me is that they got caught in something so blatant because historically they're much better at cheating than this. Historically, they didn't get caught until there were whistleblowers. And you can go back and look at competitions like this. The Olympics, Russia in particular, we know a lot about. They were doping up all of their athletes. They were giving them performance-enhancing drugs. And they had this grand scheme to avoid getting caught. And as far as they're concerned, they do that because they believe it's the norm. And there's good reason to think it is the norm, even in other places, even perhaps in the U.S. Lance Armstrong was caught cheating, a famous cyclist, right? Won a ton of medals. There were a variety of allegations. One of the interesting points that I heard made by people talking about that was they argued, and perhaps rightly so,
that everyone
Lance's medals should not have been taken from him because he was competing against other people who were doing the same thing. And this person, partially in jest probably, but he did the documentary that exposed this whole thing. And he was going to expose it by cheating. He actually became an athlete and was going into these things and was trying to cheat and was getting people's help. And anyway, stumbles upon people who wanted to talk about it more openly than his undercover work led him to the right people who then were much more frank about it. But the idea was that you had to go to this doctor speculated who was helping people cheat, that you'd have to get to like 70th place or higher before you could find athletes competing in those races who were not doped up. In which case, Lance Armstrong, I mean, a level playing field if anything goes, right?
With sports,
he
that's all
won
we care.
fair and
that's all
square.
we care about. As long as everyone's doped up, then you're good.
Then medals, consider those medals earned. But obviously this isn't great, right? We don't want a world necessarily where people are, I'm not endorsing this. We don't want a world where the athletes have to decide whether to exchange their long-term health or even their short-term health for immediate performance gains.
No, see, Dan, I would argue that what we're talking about and what we would be arguing is the exact opposite. What we're saying is that there isn't real testing right now. There isn't a system that's stopping people from cheating, especially by use of drugs, which is actually encouraging people to cheat. And that, in fact, people like Lance Armstrong would have been much less likely to cheat if he were the only one doing it. You know what I mean? That if there were a system in place that were stopping 99% of the people from cheating, it would be a very different system.
Yes, because as it is, you have to cheat to compete. Is at least a justification that you could rightfully make in some of these competitions.
No, and it's evident by the fact that these scandals keep popping up. I mean, steroid scandals in the U.S. happen all the time. I mean, everyone knows that in professional athletics, people use drugs and use all sorts of things on a regular basis to try and game the system, and yet it keeps happening.
Yeah, and it's testosterone in particular and steroids that affect it is really difficult because some people just have higher testosterone naturally, right? This is something that varies. A lot of this stuff varies naturally in one dimension or another. And so you could theoretically choose a level at which everyone must be at or below.
Yeah.
And to some degree, there's talk of people doing that already with testosterone, especially with it in relation to gender, the gender questions. But anyway, it's we're not here to solve how the Olympics should stop people from cheating. We're here to say that the system is stupid and that the way it's working right now, people are cheating and they're getting away with it. She is still going to be allowed to compete in the solo competition, and she's going to win, and she probably deserves to win, and she's probably competing against other people who are doing something similar.
Yeah, and the argument they made is it's been 6.5 weeks. If she had a positive drug test that was faulty and we got it back 2 days later, she could have taken another test and said, hey, look, that was a faulty test, I'm clean or whatever, and they can't do that now because it's 6.5 weeks later.
Yes, which is a legitimate argument. Yeah, something may have happened with it, and now,
to which the response is, well, you didn't write priority on it, so now it's your fault. and the whole thing is, but that's the point, is the whole thing is so crooked that argument could end up flying. It could end up working, that she's not getting the same treatment as everyone else because everyone else's treatment is so lenient that they can cheat if they want to, whether or not they are.
Yes. And the idea, obviously marking priority on it probably wasn't her fault. I would guess that she's not handling that kind of thing.
Well, she's 15. She's probably not handling any of it.
anything. Yes, not arranging anything. Yeah, it's interesting. If you were to remove politics from the equation and you had athletes competing to see who was the best, I think it would be a very different environment, and I think it'd be a lot more fun. I think it'd be a lot more fun. I'm trying to think. You'd probably end up with teams anyway and things, but I want to know who the best is, and I want to see high level competition. I don't want to see political posturing. Mm-hmm. There's enough of that in the world. And speaking of posturing, Russia and Ukraine. Let me begin with this by just saying where we were, and then Brad, maybe you can take us into this. We said earlier that this was posturing. And the news in that there was suggested that it may not even be a substantial thing, not even be, that it may be nothing, and if it is something, it's posturing, was essentially what we'd indicated. It doesn't appear to be nothing, unfortunately. That would have been the best solution, that people were just freaking out because Russia is doing troops and it's a distraction, right? It's a news ploy. It's not a news ploy, unfortunately, at least it doesn't appear to be anymore. In fact, you can go back 3 months, and this has been building up for 3 months. I was shocked to find a record of it, of communications and debate over Ukraine joining NATO and Russia claiming they were not going to let it fly, and the U.S. saying we're going to retaliate if you don't, and conversations between Putin and Biden that have been, discussed openly. And this seemed to come out of nowhere 2 weeks ago in terms of the focus of the news, but it's on a low simmer for a while. Yes. Is it going to just be posturing? I think that's still the most likely thing, but we're going to discuss it.
Yeah, and I think the argument that it's primarily posturing is mostly true. I think posturing may not be the perfect term, and in some ways I'd say it's a bit of a bluff. I mean, the history of Russia is one we're all familiar with. I mean, the Cold War is long gone in the United States, but it's not long gone in Russia. Russia for several decades controlled a large number of Eastern European nations. I mean, it was much more than just Russia. It was the Soviet bloc that had a lot of power and a lot of influence. And when the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia was left much weaker, and they've been much weaker ever since. You know what I mean? Russia has never been the player that the Soviet Union was. So that I think is the first background when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine involvement. Then you've got the fact that you've got all of these Eastern European countries that after leaving Russia end up joining NATO, which changes their relationship with Russia and gives them significant bargaining power because NATO gives them protection. So you've got these small countries like Estonia and Latvia that are peanuts compared to Russia. You know what I mean? In terms of their military force, their economic influence, if they come to negotiate with Russia, they don't have a lot of power. But because they joined NATO, they do have power. They do have the ability to say, we stand on our own 2 feet, and Russia, you can't intimidate us. You can't threaten to invade us in order to secure more favorable trade deals. Versus the Ukraine, where Russia can say that, and Russia has said that. There was the Crimean conflict, or the Russian-Ukrainian, war, whatever you'd want to call it, in 2014 that broke out between Russia and Ukraine because of these kinds of disagreements and resulted in actual land battles and territory changing. Russia gained control of Crimea and also small portions of the Ukraine, which had, an impact on the Ukraine. And then, of course, the U.S. and other NATO allies then sanctioned Russia, which had severe economic impact on Russia. And there's all this history that goes into it. And And that conflict was never really resolved peacefully. You know what I mean? Russia still holds Crimea, or at least portions of it. You know, Russia is still hostile towards Ukraine, and Ukraine's still hostile towards Russia. And then Ukraine wants to join NATO, and that's how this new conflict begins again, is that Ukraine is once again making an effort to join NATO. And me and Dan were joking about it before, because it's basically what Russia's saying is, don't join NATO or we're going to invade you. And it's like, okay, well, what happens if I join NATO? Well, it stops us from being able to invade you. And it's like, well, then why do you want us to not join NATO? It's because you want to invade us? Is there any other good reason for why we shouldn't join NATO? But I don't think it's because Russia wants to invade Ukraine. I think it's because Russia wants to use the fact that they can invade Ukraine as a threat to keep Ukraine under their control to some degree. And that's something that we see time and time again, is that Russia likes being the bully. It likes using their influence to control what Ukraine does. And by the way, I don't want to pick on Russia too much. This is how large, powerful countries exert their influence. It's not always invasion, but they use economic sanctions. They use trade negotiations and agreements to bully smaller countries into doing what they want. Russia is just much more blatant about it and much less subtle and not politically correct in the way that they do it. They haven't realized and accepted the fact that most modern countries now, especially European countries, are not okay with the threat of invasion in order to secure more favorable trade agreements. They're not okay with that kind of behavior, but Russia still wants to play the game that way. And so Russia right now is posturing to some degree in that their goal here is using the threat of violence to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. I mean, it's that simple, in order to keep Ukraine under their control. That's what I think is happening. I don't think they actually want to invade Ukraine. I don't think they're planning on invading Ukraine. And I think it's going to work. I think Ukraine won't join NATO. They won't say they're never going to join NATO, but they're going to postpone. You know what I mean? And that is going to be good enough for Russia. That's my whole prediction in a nutshell.
And that makes a lot of sense, because initially my thought was, as we discussed it before, we thought we were trying to look for the motivation. You know, what does Russia get out of this? If they invade, and to understand what Russia would get out of this and what's at stake here, you got to understand what would happen if they invaded. There's an idea that if they invaded, the U.S. would go and fight them, and that's not true. That's not what would happen. If you look at Biden has said as much, that's not what's going to happen.
And we're not talking about the gaffe, by the way, when he said, if it's a small incursion, we'll have to fight about it. We're talking about other instances where he's made clear that there would be severe consequences, but he uses the word consequences because he's talking about something beyond troops. He's talking about economic sanctions, which are severe consequences, but it's very different from the U.S. sending in troops to Ukraine.
Yes. He said, this is speaking of a call that he had with Putin. He said, I made it very clear, this is quote, I made it very clear, if in fact he invades Ukraine, there will be severe consequences. But the idea the United States is going to unilaterally use force to confront Russia from invading Ukraine is not in the cards right now. Close quote. This is from the New York Post, reported this.
And it makes sense, because if we were going to send in troops to defend Ukraine, then the most logical thing would be to send in troops now in order to stop Russia from invading. Is we send in 40,000 troops along the border, and next thing you know, Russia doesn't want to invade because now they realize invading will it's not even a question of if, but will cause U.S. to get involved. Because once troops are there, it's clear cut. You look at
U.S. are involved.
You look at the NATO members. In fact, let me share my screen real quick. Because you look at the NATO members that are all near the Ukraine, and guess what? They have NATO and U.S. troops in their countries. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. These countries...
And there's a wall.
Yeah, these countries all have very small amounts of NATO troops, which are the numbers in red, and U.S. troops, the numbers in... Is that purple or blue? Either way. And the point is, yes, 500 US troops in Lithuania are not going to stop any Russian invasion. But the point is, as long as those 500 troops are there, Russia cannot conquer Lithuania without having to declare war on the United States. And it's that simple of a system. And that's how the NATO system works. By putting those small amount of troops there, they say this is a NATO protected country and a US protected country. And the only way you can conquer this country is by fighting NATO. And
you mess with one bean, you mess with the whole burrito.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually a relatively simple system. And it's an effective system. And that's the system that Russia does not want with the Ukraine. Because as soon as those troops are there, Russia can no longer threaten Ukraine with invasion. It can no longer eke out small amounts of territory like it did with Crimea. It changes their relationship with Ukraine because they don't have the same relationship with Ukraine that they have with Estonia. And the reason is because of Estonia's membership in NATO.
Yes, there's a parallel to this that we sometimes talk about in foreign policy, and it's if you have nuclear power, if you have nuclear weapons, there is a massive rush to get nuclear weapons because as soon as you have nuclear weapons, your international relationships change, and it's entirely in your favor.
You get a huge amount of respect all of a sudden.
Yes, all of a sudden, your trade deals and your negotiations are much stronger. Mm-hmm. And it's because you're not as militarily dependent on others. You are now a legitimate threat. And even in a world where we're not all at war all the time, that still matters.
Absolutely.
That's still a critical part of the negotiation. The fact that Russia can say, and by the way, I can beat you up and take your lunch money if I wanted to, is an important part of how their negotiations go down. And there's been a serious breakdown in those, as you might imagine, with the Crimea stuff. But it would shift even further should they become independent in a military sense. And Russia doesn't want that. Makes a lot of sense. It changes the relationship between them. It raises Ukraine and lowers their negotiating power. It also may provide staging areas for U.S. troops and things closer to Russia.
And it's worth noting that Ukraine and Russia are trading partners. I mean, partner is a weird word, but they have trade. They have established trade between those two countries that benefits both countries. So the trade issue is a real one, that Russia currently has economic benefits from their trade agreements with Ukraine. And so if Ukraine changes those trade agreements, it costs Russia, theoretically.
Yes, it's interesting. Reading the history between them. Another thing, joining NATO is one thing that has upset Russia. Joining the EU's free trade areas
was another
also
upset
problem. Russia, set off things. Yes, because it made them
hurt
less
Russia.
dependent.
Yeah, I was speaking in the wrong tense.
Yeah,
it's not something that could hurt Russia. They did hurt Russia.
Yes, they did hurt Russia when they joined that because they now have other options, right? As soon as you've got, if I can go to several different stores, the negotiating power of that store, of one particular store, is less, right? They can't, their prices, they have to compete with the others now for my attention. It's simple supply and demand. All of this, though, there's still some questions. I'm stating this as if I'm 100% confident in these things. I think what we've proposed here makes a lot of sense. It's still really weird because it puts these maneuvers as a kind of, I'm trying to remember who I heard phrase it this way, a massive game of chicken.
Yeah.
Where Russia's like, I think you're going to swerve first.
Well, and it makes sense. It makes sense that Russia would say, because there's evidence of it, we're happier going to war than you are. You know what I mean? That we're less afraid of a violent and bloody conflict that's totally pointless than you are. And in some senses, that's true. You know what I mean? That Ukraine doesn't want a bloody war within its own borders, even if it comes out to mostly nothing. Like the Crimean War, not the Crimean War from a long, long time ago, but the Crimean conflict, the recent one in 2014, was bad for Russia, but it was also very bad for Ukraine. And those have very real costs. Enough costs that Ukraine might say, yeah, I'm okay waiting to join NATO. in order to avoid this current conflict.
Yes. Yeah. That's an interesting thought. It's interesting. If Russia invaded and they brought upon themselves the sanctions that would follow there, that'd be really, really rough. And it does matter if people don't buy Russian oil, and they've got a crazy amount of natural resources, but they depend on those resources because their economic productivity is not very good.
They need trade with other
Turns out
nations.
that widespread corruption and nationalization of industries is not a good combination.
I mean, to be fair, most nations rely on trade. I mean, even like the United States, who produces a ton of natural resources too, we rely
if you
heavily
cut trade,
on trade.
we would be really
huge
messed up.
economic consequences.
No, you're absolutely right. That's a great point.
It would make the 2008, 2009 recession look like nothing if we cut off economic trade. If we were sanctioned by the rest of the world, oh my goodness, it'd be devastating.
Oh yeah, it'd be the worst thing that's ever happened to our economy ever. It'd be way worse than the Great Depression. You'd have to ration everything, and it would be disastrous. You're absolutely right. That's a great point. It's not necessarily a sign of economic weakness that trade embargoes and that sanctions devastate you. That's more the reality of supply chains at this point in the world. You can rearrange those and you could become independent again. And some countries do that better than others, but it would be devastating for every country.
And we have talked about sanctions before and about how sometimes they're not real sanctions. They're
as much posturing as troop movements on the border.
As anything else, but there is a history of sanctioning Russia in the past, like after the Crimea conflict, that were real sanctions. It's not like they were completely cut off from trade, but it did have an economic cost that hurt them.
Yes. And it's interesting who will support them in those occasions. It's at that point that you really need allies who you can still trade with, and preferably people on your border that you can use their airspace and things at least to transport goods. It's interesting. I keep looking at if there were to be a massive, I mean, if it would be a real tragedy if Russia took Ukraine. Extending their reach over more people is not something that anyone wants. Good things for people should want for anybody. But China and Russia, it could be much worse. I keep thinking of in what world could Russia gain more than that? In some ways, I think the era of world domination, of the Germans trying to control everything, of people trying to not just grab a little bit from the lands around them, but really conquer the world, the World War II level of dominion.
Well, and I think you can make a very real argument for the fact that it was the Manhattan Project, not World War II, that signaled a change in world wars. Because there is that fact that when Biden is talking to the diplomatic team from Russia and they've got all these negotiations going on, underlying all of this is an understanding that we have nukes and Russia has nukes, and that we do not want to put either nation in a position where they feel like they have no options. Because as soon as you have a nation that has nuclear weapons, that has no options, then they might use them. I mean, there's a reason we don't do anything to North Korea, because it's not worth it. North Korea and the Western world has an understanding. North Korea can be as awful as it wants to its own people as long as they don't attack South Korea. Because if they nuke South Korea, then they would be over for North Korea. But as long as they don't do that, they can basically do whatever they want because they have nukes. And it's that kind of understanding that goes into all of these negotiations. And it's very true here that the US wants to be very careful because they don't want to have open war with Russia, because they don't want it to lead to nuclear war. And so they're going to compromise. They're going to blink in the face of that threat and say, okay, we can agree, Ukraine won't be a part of NATO for now in order to avoid the chance for a major conflict, which is in some ways kind of good, because it does stop World War III from breaking out, because everyone knows that World War III would most likely end.
It'd be terrible.
in some kind of nuclear war, and that's not something anyone wants. And we're all rational people here. People argue that Russia's not, but when you actually break it down, what Russia is doing, it may be a game of chicken, but it's very calculated and actually makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, it's the same game of chicken that bullies tend to play in negotiations. The way you phrased it earlier was, I think, really good. The idea that you're more afraid of pain than I am. And if we fight, I'm very comfortable in that arena. I'm okay with that. This idea that the bully is comfortable in the violence. Of course, when you actually push back, that may or may not be the case, but that's at least the impression that people get, and that's the intimidation factor.
No, and I think there's an argument to be made for pushing back, for the U.S. going to Ukraine and being like, this is ridiculous. This game that's been played for the past 20 years is a bluff. So what we think you should do is join NATO and join it now, because then because once, and it's one of the weird things in this situation, is once Ukraine joins NATO, it's over. Russia's lost, and they're not going to invade Ukraine. The only time they can invade Ukraine is if Ukraine's thinking about joining NATO, because once they join NATO, it's over. And
when we were looking into this, I kept looking at, what does it take to join NATO? Because can't this just be like it used to be like, oh, I want to be a part of NATO. And you're like, you want to fight communists? Come join us. Like, you're in. But now there's requirements and applications, and an agreement must be made, and plans must be drawn up, and bureaucracy must happen. And so I was not able to determine a clear process, in part because it seems to be individually negotiated, and there are certain standards they must meet that I assume Ukraine could meet if other European countries can meet it. But it's weird there, right? Because it seems like you could wake up in the morning and be like, sorry, Russia, we did it. and that would be over.
And the whole conflict would end.
The troops are on the way, and if you're here when they get here,
well, and even if the troops aren't there yet, once they're officially part of NATO, it would be over.
Yeah, there's an obligation there. Yeah, it's strange. So somewhere in this, I love the idea that the real villain here is bureaucracy. It's not. You think Russia's bad? You should see the bureaucracy you have to get through to join NATO.
Well, and part of it's that, but part of it is the fact that U.S. doesn't care about Ukraine. You know what I mean? That the Crimean conflict in 2014 didn't hurt the United States. It hurt Ukraine a heck of a lot, but it didn't hurt the United States. That the United States isn't invested enough in Ukraine prospering, and that's part of it. You know what I mean? And not to be dismissive of Ukraine's crisis, because it is real and it is there, but it's not a U.S. crisis. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that needs to be factored in, that when the president of the United States is looking at this conflict, his goal is not what's best for Ukraine. His goal is what's best for the United States. And so settling right now is for Ukraine. It's good for Russia, and it's not bad at all for the United States because you avoid conflict.
Right, which is why from the beginning I'd be shocked, and still would be shocked, if there was actual military engagement
of any significance,
because it's just so mutually destructive. It doesn't really benefit anybody, and so it would just extremely unlikely. Now the U.S. or the powers that be should act like it might be a legitimate threat. You shouldn't just put your head down, but the idea that it's going to lead to conflict, I think, is extremely unlikely, and always has been, regardless of how many troops are there.
But it's definitely a weird situation, and it's because it's one of those things where I bet there were probably a couple of opportunities in the past where the Ukraine could have joined NATO, and the opportunity was just
there
missed.
Must have been, right?
And
they go through presidents. If you look into the history of this a little bit, their various presidents have had different takes on what to do about it. The people have been pretty clear, I think, and consistent in wanting to join NATO and distance themselves from Russia, even though a lot of them are of Russian descent. They don't want Russia controlling them. The exception being the people in Crimea, generally, which
or
is
at
why
least some
that
people
whole
in
thing,
Crimea. Yeah, I don't know what the actual numbers are.
Yeah, for those of you not familiar with that little part of of the justification was that they had declared themselves a sovereign nation.
There were these separatists in Crimea who were pushing back against Ukraine, and so Russia's arguing we're just freeing these people,
Yes, and these separatists had they had their own parliament and things, and that was under Ukraine, and so Ukraine had given them some independence. It seemed to be almost like a Scotland situation.
Or Ireland.
Yes, yeah, where they're part of the country, but they've got some level of independence, and because they're recognized as distinct. And anyway, Russia annexed them, is their words. A free nation chose to join another free nation.
It's weird. It's weird.
Somehow other parts of Ukraine came with it that we're not touching. If you look at the map and what they acquired. But anyway, it's complicated, and you're right that it's not America's problem per se. Russia isn't going to take over Ukraine and then from there leverage that.
Yeah, it's not the Cold War anymore. We're not concerned about, hey, we've got this western tip of Ukraine where if they staged their missile silos there, it could get them that much closer to, our bases here, and that could, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, to the European countries.
That used to be the game.
I mean,
that was the Cuban Missile Crisis was, okay, well, what if they staged their missiles here? They're that much closer. Well, what about this and what about that? And that's why we need to take, it was all just this big battle that was being played out through other nations, but it's no longer that way. The U.S. is not trying to stop Russia from taking over the world. The U.S. is really just trying to stop a major conflict from breaking out because that would be bad for the U.S. politically. You know what I mean? If Russia and Ukraine fight, even if we don't get involved, it looks bad for the White House.
It does.
And so really Biden's main goal is just to stop conflict from breaking out. Whatever Ukraine has to concede, he's fine with that. I mean, it's crass and it's cynical, but this is how politics is played on the big stages. There's not a lot of nobility in these negotiations. There really isn't.
Yes, it would somehow be a Republican victory for there to be a serious conflict because it would suggest incompetence in Biden. And that would, again, U.S. government power is at stake in how this looks and how it plays out. And as such, the actors within those are going to try and control the story and make the other side make Biden look unfavorable through these events. And that's why when we were talking about how this event could be a show a week or two ago when we were discussing this, there are occasions like this where everybody goes home happy because everyone has looked good in front of their own people. Mm-hmm. We when we're thinking international, we tend to forget that they also need to keep the people inside their countries happy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe Putin has factions within that he is a leader of that need this kind of show of strength occasionally, right? Mm-hmm. We assume that this is like a rational actor, a single rational actor with a plan, whereas it may be a rational actor navigating his own political factions within the country to try and appease them all. And in the same way that Biden is going to try and handle this in a way that does that. And Ukrainian presidents are going to try and handle this in a way that does that. And there's internal factors that determine a lot of these bigger decisions that we don't have an inside scoop of like we do in the United States and in the internal politics of Moscow and of whatever the capital of Ukraine is.
Kiev, I think.
I was going to say Kiev, but
if it's not, then why don't we know its name? Why do we know Kiev and not them?
What is Kiev if it's not Kiev?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we could Google it. That's what we'll be doing for the next week.
We're going to have an episode that's just, what is the capital of Ukraine?
What is...
Here you go.
Tune in next week.
Maybe next week we're going to do a history of Belarus and figure out why Belarus is not part of NATO. Because we got the Ukraine and we got Belarus over here, not part of NATO. And I'm looking at it and I look at the history of Ukraine and okay, and there's some history here. What's up with Belarus? Why didn't they join NATO? So tune in.
Are they under Russia's thumb too?
Tune in,
what's happening
maybe never
here?
To find out.
Take care, guys.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.